Hi, my name's Mary Halstead. I'm going to be presenting a talk to you on herbs in the modern age, herbal medicine in the modern age, and why that such a thing might still be desirable or useful. Let me start by introducing myself. As I said, my name's Mary Halstead. I have a certification in clinical herbalism. I served a 4-year apprenticeship to get that certification. Unlike most of the herbalists I know, which is not to say all of them, I don't know all of them, but most of the ones I know came to this study through a love of plants, a love of nature, a love of gardening, and they're truly tremendous at it. I came from a slightly different direction. My background is in classical and medieval history. I came across the great figures of herbal history first, not as an herbalist, but as a historian. And several years later, when I got seriously interested in herbal medicine, I returned to those sources from an entirely different angle. Wasn't thinking anymore about their importance historically. I was thinking about their importance to me in my life now in the most practical sense. So, as I say, I have a business, a small one. It's called Raven and the Hawthorn Tree Herbalism. I do writing. In theory, I see clients, although that definitely is a bit difficult right now. But right now, I'm not here to talk about myself. I'm here to talk about the subject that I care about quite passionately, herbalism. So let me start the formal talk by asking the rhetorical question, why herbs? When this talk was first planned, which is almost a year ago now, a great deal has happened since then, hasn't it? I would have approached the question somewhat more broadly. But health-wise, as we know quite well, there's one main thing on everyone's mind these days, and it too is a valid starting point. Looking at the problem from this particular direction, we might say, why herbs? When all the world is working so intensively on this one medical issue, making use of technology that most of us, certainly including me, to be blunt, have no conception of. And when we need that technology to work so very badly. But then we turn and look in the other direction. Public health, unfortunately, has been proven to be horribly underfunded and full of dangerous holes. People in a time of crisis neglect ordinary preventative care. They're often too frightened to risk a doctor's office for screening or non-life-threatening chronic conditions. What are they to do? Both of these sideways glances do ignore the ground we stand on. Look to one side, you look to the other side, but you also have to look down. This is the same ground that we've always stood on. It's my firm conviction that people, whether they know it or not, always have made and always will make use of medicinal herbs, because many foods and almost all plant foods are medicinal. We don't notice them because we've been taught to regard only pills as medicine. Let me go back a long bit. The earliest evidence of human beings using plants for medicine is archaeological. It long predates writing. I can trace later developments in the West better because, as I said, my study was always classical and medieval history. I prefer to speak about things that I know and understand well instead of speculating about things that went on in other parts of the world and other times in history where, quite frankly, I would probably be wrong about an awful lot of things. So, speaking in terms of Western, that is to say, Europe, the Mediterranean, parts of the Middle East, Western herbalism, I want to introduce a term that's really vital for understanding the developments that I'm going to be talking about, and that term is energetics. Now, I believe that this term has a more formal dictionary meaning, has to do with physics, possibly, or something similar to that. But in terms of herbalism, what this means is it's extremely simple. The qualities of coolness or warmth, of dryness or moistness. Okay. It seems to me very unlikely, in fact impossible, that all people everywhere have not always perceived and understood the energetics of herbs and of illness. You just can't eat mint, chickweed, or cucumber without feeling a cooling effect, or garlic, rosemary, or ginger without feeling warmth? Who could possibly fail to notice the moistening effect of aloe vera on the skin or the drying effect of witch hazel, an astringent? So when I talk about energetics, although it seems maybe esoteric or mystical in some sort of a way, I'm only talking about these four extremely basic qualities. Now, on the same tack, an illness will usually have easily discernible energetics. If you stop to think about it for a second. Shivers and a lot of clear mucus, for instance, okay? That's coldness, that's moistness, or fever and a painful dry sore throat and cough on the other end of things. That's heat, that's dryness. We must therefore assume, speaking historically, the existence of many hundreds or, well, no, I don't mean hundreds, actually many thousands, tens of thousands of years of good understanding of these things long before anyone sat down and tried to explain them in writing. The place and time in the West, I say again because that's what I know, that they really did get down to explaining them was classical Greece. And that led to an entire philosophy of medicine that was practiced in Europe officially until approximately 200 years ago or so, and continues to be practiced officially in the Middle East today. They're still a well-respected field of medicine, ranging from the Eastern Mediterranean all the way to India, that derives from this as informed by other traditions. Farther east, the Ayurvedic system, which I can say, although I am not an Ayurvedic practitioner and I don't speak from knowledge about it at all, was written down significantly earlier. I can tell you that much. Originates in India, okay? And farther still to the east, we have traditional Chinese medicine. All these things, the system that I'm referring to in the Middle East that derives partly from Greek, Ayurvedic in India, traditional Chinese medicine farther to the east, not just China, but that part of the world. All of these constitute living traditions. And what I mean by that is that they've never been interrupted. They've been practiced continuously. They've been taught continuously. They've been respected continuously since, as I said, thousands of years ago. And they have many similarities because they also work on an understanding of the same energetics. Terminology varies, precise classifications vary, but they talk about the same energetics. Now, other parts of the world still, say for instance, Australia, Africa, the Americas, I know even less about. And so I don't want to speak at all that far outside my area of knowledge. I don't even necessarily want to go so far that they talk about exactly the same energetics, although if I were a betting person, I would bet money on it because those energetics are unavoidable. Okay, so now, as I said, officially in Europe, this system was practiced until about 200 years ago, give or take. Then it was supplanted by what we recognize as conventional Western medicine. It had probably, I don't want to get into too much specific history here that you may not be interested in, but it had been deteriorating a little bit for a few hundred years before that. And it kind of, as practiced officially, kind of petered out. This would be around the time that, the scientific process took over. Essentially, medical schools were formalized, and all of a sudden, the old systems fell into disrepute. Unofficially, everybody kept right on with it. Many people, especially those with the money to utilize up-to-date medicine, have forgotten almost all the hedge and wood plants their ancestors knew. But as long as one person indulges in hot sauce, another person in garlic, and a third in cucumber salad, we would be lying if we said there were no herbs and no herbal medicine. They're still gravitating toward the energetics they desire. I've spoken briefly of the energetics of plants and of illnesses, but when I describe an individual person's preference and taste, I'm describing the energetics of the individual. This may seem like more of a dicey proposition, It may strike a chord in some of your minds, and that chord is called the theory of the humors, which again is going to involve us in too much specific history. But I will say briefly that I consider that to be a mistake of theory and a very, very much unnecessary outshoot of the workable and unavoidable energetic medicine. So, once again, all over the world, and since before recorded history, sorry to keep repeating myself, the art of herbal medicine has been to connect these three factors correctly: the person, the plant, and the health problem. Thus, let us say a person who is ordinarily chilly and with a dry skin comes down with a fever and a wet cough. The art of the herbalist is to recommend an herb which is appropriate in the sense that it addresses the cause of the illness, because a lot of herbs are antiviral, antibacterial, or both. An herb that does not stress the person's system past a comfort level, because some herbs are much harsher than others. And an herb that eases symptoms. This can be a complicated art. And just so you know, I wasn't proposing a question that I didn't have an answer to. In this particular case, I might recommend a tea of elderflower, marshmallow root, and hyssop. So that's an example of what I mean when I talk about the energetics of an individual human being. What's more complicated, of course, is knowing what makes a harmonious relationship between herbs and conventional medicine. Now, I'm going to keep sort of coasting around my introductory, the quandary, which is why herbs now when we're in this massive crisis. So long ago, there were only the former herbs. Then, although we could never stop using the foods our bodies desired as a medicine, specific herbal knowledge was lost, and there was only the latter, except in cases of remote populations, usually rural, usually poor. They were the ones who kept the knowledge, and thankfully so, because we've benefited from it a great deal since then. But thanks to a shift in general mindset nowadays, the study of the written sources, which also thankfully we still have, and a lot of useful borrowing from other herbal world philosophies that I referred to above, and different herbalists in different parts of the world gravitate to other systems to borrow from. That's always been an ongoing process. Now we have choices, and perhaps too many. Hello, welcome to part 2 of my library talk on the subject of, generally speaking, why herbs now or forever. Now, I had closed off last time by saying that it was possible that in this age of the world we have too many choices, after a brief run through of herbs working in concert with modern conventional medicine. So what could I possibly have meant by too many choices? Well, in a nutshell, I'm talking about supplements, which occupy a sort of muddled area in between herbs and modern conventional medicine. Now, this could mean vitamins. It could mean isolated, naturally occurring substances like theanine, which is an amino acid taken for anxiety and mental clarity. And when I say an amino acid, I am not entirely sure what I'm talking about because I am not a chemist. It could even mean, broadly, it could even mean, this may seem like a bit of a stretch, but it could mean powdered herbs in capsules. Now, most herbalists I know aren't too keen on supplements. They either fall outside our scope of knowledge, like the theanine. We're not chemists. I always joke around, well, yes, the running gag is, if I were good at technology, if I were good at science, or anything of that sort, I wouldn't be an herbalist to begin with. So these things may be things that we don't actually know what they are as herbalists, or if they are things that we know about, like, for instance, powdered herbs in capsules, we know they aren't optimal. Okay, modern people are used to pills, and we like them because they're easy to swallow. But the truth is very few herbs remain effective dried and powdered. Some do, particularly spices. And by the way, I will be talking a good bit more about spices soon. But most herbs don't. They become little more than dust. And that's even assuming that you get what the label says you're getting, which you often don't. There have been some in-depth investigations of this because herbs are not, the herbal market is not terribly regulated in this country. And so these things they've done some investigations, and they're not very cheering. Quite often the desired plant, what the label says you're getting, has been adulterated. That means it's been mixed with or replaced with another plant, which unfortunately can be a poisonous one in some cases. And that's really truly unfortunate. I mean, it's very unfortunate from the point of view of the person who's bought the adulterated herb, which may wind up severely hurting them. It's also unfortunate from the point of herbalism, generally speaking, because the herb, which was safe and beneficial to begin with, can come out of it with a bad reputation. They'll say, this happened with skullcap, which is an herb that people take for relaxation and for other things. Don't need to get into too much detail about skullcap right now. But it was commonly adulterated with another semi-poisonous plant in decades past. And this seriously damaged the reputation of skullcap, so that people who maybe aren't quite in the know about the process of how this came to be will say, like, oh, skullcap, that's poisonous. You don't want to touch that. Well, skullcap isn't poisonous. Certainly it's not poisonous properly used, but it was mixed up with some other stuff for quite a while. So that can happen with capsules. And in extreme cases, it can just be sawdust in there. Now, I realize that some brands are more reputable than others, and I'm not going into this to try to cast aspersions on all the companies out there that market herbs and capsules, or any supplement for that matter. It's just that supplements, in the opinion of most herbalists I know, as I've said before, are a little bit dodgy. Like, if anything's going to be considered dangerous here, that might be the thing. Now, the preparation of an herbal medicine is a vitally important aspect of the art. And it's usually neglected in mainstream sources. So I could sort of branch out from this, like problems with capsules, problems with supplements, which may not have the best sourcing. Again, when people discuss these, they don't take into account preparation. I'm making the assumption that to a scientist, it would make sense that a plant is a plant. And as long as you're dealing with the same plant with the same chemical composition and you're not changing it, it ought to always behave the same way. But herbalists, who have existed in the world for many thousands of years, as I spoke about last time, learned almost everything they know empirically, which is by experience, by trial and error. Long before they were flirting with the possibility of chemical compounds that could be changed or couldn't be changed, they knew what did what under which circumstances. So some herbs are best prepared with water, some with alcohol, and some with oils or fats. Like traditionally in Northern Europe, they would often use pork fat for these things. Now we get a little squeamish about making herbal preparations with pork fat or mutton fat these days, so we tend to prefer olive oil or coconut oil, that type of thing. That's what I mean by oils or fats. Some herbs are very much foods in themselves, such as nettle, an herb so almost universally useful that we say, when in doubt, take nettle. Difficult to go wrong with it, very difficult. These are some of the ones that do well in water, and what you can do, and this is a sort of an herbalist standby, is steep an herb like nettle or milky oats, or there's a few other possibilities for that, but you could steep it in large amounts for many hours. And this produces a nutrient-rich mega tea, which we call a long infusion. And I can always answer questions about these things, by the way, too, if anyone would like more detail about long infusions. Now, other herbs which might potentially contain substances which in large amounts or if used inappropriately might be dangerous to the health. We can sometimes add those to regular short steep tea. That's like a small amount of herb that's only steeped for 10 or 15 minutes, or they can be extracted in alcohol as a tincture. A medicinal plant properly used will not be harmful, because the ones that might be are recommended only in very small doses or very occasionally. We pay attention to things that may build up in the liver, for instance, and we say, if you're going to use it, you have to use it only under certain circumstances. You have to use it very cautiously, and you have to use it for short periods of time. Also, and I'm straying back into the danger zone of chemistry here, a whole plant contains substances which buffer one another. What may irritate while healing has its harsher effects mitigated by its fellow phytochemicals, plant chemicals. This is why herbalists prefer to use whole plants and not to try to isolate active ingredients, as you often see written on packages. To an herbalist, every ingredient is an active ingredient. They're all performing a sort of harmonious dance with one another to work a certain way in the body. And there are hardly any exceptions to this rule. Ginkgo is probably the only one that occurs to me off the top of my head. And as a side note, this is another reason to avoid capsules, okay? One of our most valuable clues with plants, and one that we've made use of for not just thousands of years, not just tens of thousands of years, but for hundreds of thousands of years, is the sense of taste. And the first swallow of a tea, when you taste the tea on your tongue, taste the tincture on your tongue, it should give you information about whether a plant is suitable. I don't just mean whether or not it's poisonous. Hopefully nobody's drinking tea or taking tincture that's actually poisonous, like poison ivy. Hopefully nobody's drinking poison ivy tea, but also whether it suits you as an individual. Okay, with capsules, we lose that sense, and it does become possible to do real damage. You swallow a capsule, maybe if you're feeling adventurous, you swallow 2 or 3, and you don't realize till later that that is not going to agree with you. Okay, and talking of damage, what about interactions with prescription medications? All right, obviously, as we know, I can't quote a percentage off the top of my head, but a very large percentage of the population of this country in the current year does take prescription medication of some kind, often more than one. This is something that we know can cause trouble even with physicians prescribing medications that have interactions with each other. It's a complaint that I've actually heard as an herbalist before, that someone didn't take enough care about prescribing medications that had interactions. And interactions are possible between herbs and prescription medications. Now, as a starting point, I'd say that this is a point in the favor of herbs, okay? It wouldn't be a problem to take burdock along with your hyperglycemia medication if burdock did not also work to lower blood sugar. It would be just, it would just be like, eating a bowl of cereal along with your hyperglycemia medication. But the fact is, burdock also lowers blood sugar. So those two things together can cause too much lowering of blood sugar. And that is another reason to work with a qualified herbalist, because interactions and contraindications are possible. You'll often hear that refrain, that you should work with a qualified herbalist, repeated. And there's good reason for it. But right now, the matter is more complicated than that. For one thing, the U.S. doesn't license herbalists, though it does license acupuncturists. A lot of European countries license herbalists. I know England does, Germany does, off the top of my head. The U.S. doesn't. I know a lot of people in the community prefer it that way because licensing would involve an ocean of paperwork. However, that does mean that there's a risk of landing on a bad practitioner. So it's important to sound out anyone you see. But as I said, it's extra complicated right now. And And in fact, it goes against the thoughts that I put forward at the beginning of this talk. Because right now, with the way things are, and y'all know what I'm talking about, people are skipping out on routine management of chronic health conditions. They're skipping out on yearly checks. They're skipping out on cancer screenings because we are all scared of going into the doctor's office. So going the rounds of the local herbal community is certainly far too much to ask. So what to do? I would encourage everyone to begin with not to try to give yourself an education in completely unfamiliar plants and chemical isolates, courtesy of pop culture. That might work, but then again, it might not. I would suggest instead that you think of what you already know. Remember, almost all plant foods are medicinal according to their separate energetics. And the very ordinary cooking herbs and spices are strongly medicinal. I'm talking about things like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, marjoram, thyme, rosemary, fennel, garlic, and many, many others. Y'all know what I mean. Let me run through a couple of these specifically. Ginger now can be used as a spice, a tea, a food, an infused beverage, like for instance, real ginger ale or ginger beer. It can be made into a steam. It can be infused in honey or combined with vinegar. It's extremely warming. It's a natural mild blood thinner and circulation stimulant. It helps you get blood to cold hands and feet. I myself suffer terribly from cold feet in the winter. I don't have very good circulation to the extremities. It has antimicrobial properties. It breaks up congestion and eases breathing. It's therefore especially good for those cold, wet colds. Of course, it's also excellent for nausea. Cinnamon now, as a powdered spice, is commonest, but you can get whole pieces of cinnamon bark. You can put those in a tea or coffee, even for a delicious effect. It's profoundly warming. It's useful for digestive upset, affects blood sugar and cholesterol levels positively, and has been used traditionally for cold, damp coughs, to stimulate sweating, and to improve peripheral circulation. That's those cold feet again. Rosemary, unlike ginger and cinnamon, is native to Europe and has been used by ordinary people their time out of mind. Because of this, it has accumulated a wealth of folklore. And as I said before, European history is what I know. So that's the folklore that I know too, which is not the subject of today's discussion, but it's a lot of fun. It was used in wedding ceremonies and at funerals, to decorate for Christmas, and to purify the air from illness or grief. It has long been believed to drive away winter grief, particularly, and to clear the mind. And in fact, some modern research has found it to be an excellent aid to thought and memory. It helps with nausea and bloating. It aids in circulation, particularly circulation to the head. That's where the thought and memory connection comes in. In order to have optimal brain function, you do need good blood circulation to the head. It can be baked in bread. It can be added to just about any savory dish. Thyme is one of the most useful antiviral herbs and has a long history of application with colds and flus. It can be made into what I call a broth tea, which is very common around my house in the wintertime. That could just be vegetable or chicken broth with a lot of garlic, ginger, and thyme added in, and steeped for 10 or 15 minutes, just like an ordinary tea. And you can strain it before drinking if you prefer it clear, or you can drink it with the lumps, whichever. These are only a few of a very large selection of medicinal plants which can be used in the kitchen every day. And then there are, among other herbs, what you might call the survivors, the ones that have never stopped being used through the decades of herbal neglect, such as chamomile, mint, hibiscus, that type of thing. Now, of course, to the sort of person who thinks about these things all the time, like myself, a lot of detail related to energetics, lesser known properties, and possible combinations will suggest itself. But this doesn't have to be the case for you. I suggest to everyone who's listening, rather, that you start from scratch with whatever opportunities you have to make some experiments. Try the spices that you like, and maybe a new one or an old one in a new way, and pay attention to how it makes you feel. Does it make you feel relaxed or invigorated? Are you breathing more easily? Do you feel warmer? Do you feel cooler? Is it a bit too much for the digestion? These are your clues as to what plants make good medicine for you yourself. Is a cooling plant uncomfortable and a warming one just right? If you notice this, you've learned something about your energetics as a living being. And it's not all just for fun, although it is fun. Chronic health issues truly can be improved or avoided altogether with the help of medicinal plants. I have seen this happen many a time. Home treatment of some acute issues is possible, and in fact, a lot of people are feeling right now like we have no choice but to try it. We may have been backed into a corner by the pandemic, but in contemplating herbs at this present moment in time, we are in fact rediscovering old friends who have loyally waited for us. There's no reason why new friends, the treatments made possible by science, I personally cannot begin to understand, can't exist in harmony with the old ones. All the good ones really ought to get along very well. And honestly, right now we need all the friends we can get. So that concludes my speech on herbs. And thank you very much for tuning in.